Well, welcome everybody. Hi, Vicky. Hi, Liz. Welcome to Montessori Lives, another conversation with a very notable Montessorian. We're very privileged to have Rebecca Dallam with us this evening. Rebecca, for those who don't know, is Director of 6 to 12 training for SMTC, Sydney Montessori Teacher Centre or College?
Training center.
Training Centre. Um, So, Rebecca, I'll let you introduce yourself and maybe say what you do currently, but also I really want to know your Montessori story. How did you
Well,
discover
I can do
Montessori?
both simultaneously, maybe.
Yeah.
Okay, so I came to Australia in 1998. I'm from the US. I did my first Montessori training in 1986, 87 through the Washington Montessori Institute. That was 3 to 6 training. And uh, I think after that, I went to work in a public Montessori magnet program in an area around the Washington, D.C., one of the suburbs. I think I worked in 3 to 6 for 7 years, but it might be 9. I might be confused. And I started knowing that I wanted to do things with the 5-year-olds that weren't really suitable 5-year-old work. So that was kind of like the tap on the shoulder saying, time to take the 6 to 12 training. So I was saving up my pennies and planning to take the year off and do the academic year training also at Washington Montessori Institute. And then they started running summer courses. So I took a summer course that I can't remember what years it was, but like 94, 95, 96, or somewhere in there. I don't know. Um, and while I did that, I worked in 6 to 9, which was like being thrown into the pool. I really had no idea what I was doing, but I did the best I could during the training. And when I finished the training, I went to a different public Montessori system, the Milwaukee Public Schools, and I worked there for 2 years until I came here to Australia. And when I came to Australia, I was briefly in Melbourne, maybe 6 months or something. I lived in Geelong for a few months and was going to be working at a place where they were going to start long daycare, but it wasn't looking like that was really happening. So I took a job in Sydney. And first, I worked over in the eastern suburbs, and then I worked at the school from which I see several faces here tonight. It was called Montessori Children's World then. Um, anyway, I worked there for, I don't know, maybe 5 years or something like that. Um, and then I had children. I had twins, so I think I took a year and a half off, something like that. And then I went back to work part-time, and about, let's see, 2006 or 2007, I enrolled in what's called the Training of Trainers program. So to become a trainer in AMI, um, you kind of apprentice with someone else. So I won't go through all of that, but that basically took 7 or so years.
Oh,
And around 2013 or 2014, I finished and became a trainer. So I'm the first and only 6 to 12 AMI trainer in Australia. I'm still waiting for people to come join my team. And I have to say, after 10 years, we're kind of hopeful that there's some new cabs coming off the rank.
Peter must be close, surely.
He should be close, but I think he has decided that's not for him.
Oh,
So yeah, so there are a few other people who have decided they want to invest their time. It's a big commitment, you know. It's not only a financial commitment, but it's a family commitment. So,
7 years, it's like doing medicine.
yeah, it is. I mean, it's kind of like making wine or something
Well,
like that, you know.
we're really doing, you know, we're really doctors for the mind in a way, right?
Yeah,
Healers for the.
yeah, that's right. And it takes time to learn those things. So,
Mm, mm.
yeah, so that's how I ended up. So I've been training for, I think it was a different organization when I started. Maybe it was Montessori Australia Foundation with ACMS, and then anyway, it doesn't really matter what it's called. I train in Sydney, and I normally run a summer course, so 3 summers, 6 to 12 training, and then I also work overseas in various places. And I find that work really fascinating because when you go meet people from other parts of the world who have the same exact questions and wonder the same things, and you can connect really deeply about these things we all care about, I just think it's fantastic. So,
Where have you done training? Oh,
well, currently I train in China and the US. I have also trained in Russia, which then, after the war slash international conflict began, we moved the course to Kazakhstan. And so some of our students were there and some were still in St. Petersburg. But I do a lot of the orientation course as well. So I don't know, those of you who know about training, there's the diploma course and the orientation course. The orientation course is kind of like a dip in the pool in a way to help people understand the theory of working with second plane children and why we do what we do, but it's not to train you to work in the classroom. And I find that in some countries that's really popular for parents because they see it as a parenting course. In some countries where there's not much access to training, they take that and then they do their best in the classroom. So I've done that in Thailand, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, Portugal, Brazil, um, Russia. I don't know, where a lot of countries, and so that's where really that international perspective comes from. So, yeah.
well, I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on the differences between teaching in the United States and Australia, being a teacher in the classroom. What have you noticed?
Uh,
Are there differences between American kids
so
and
do you want to know about the children? Do you want to know about what the teachers face? Do you want to know about implementation of Montessori? Do you want to know
yeah,
what?
all of that would whatever you'd like to, whatever comes to mind.
Okay, so I guess first of all, in the US, we have to differentiate between public and private Montessori. In Australia, it's mostly independent schools, and so we can more or less accept that children are going to come to us because their parents can afford. We have very little public Montessori here. So mostly what I think people are working with is children whose families can afford to choose this, even if we're an inexpensive school. In the US, there are many, many, many public Montessori programs, and I would say probably half or even more than of the people that I train on the course in Washington, D.C. are coming from public Montessori. And I think that they probably face significantly different situations than we have. So on a really practical level, say, for example, things that we might have in our classroom here that we would generally trust is okay as long as we've risk assessed, like we have some knives for dissecting, or we have a dissecting kit, or we have, I don't know, something along those lines where if you know your children and you know your families and you have good communication and you've risk assessed, you can have that in the environment because children need to use it and you make sure you show them how to use it. But the course assistant who was working with me a few summers ago said he would never, ever have that in his classroom. And I think, what you were talking about a few minutes ago before the recording started was about children facing trauma. I think that all children have a lot of trauma, but how much and how deep the trauma is varies, right? So they may have some unstable things in their home life, or they may have some big things like a parent in prison. And I think that when you're working in the US, you're working with that deeper end of stuff that the teachers might face. So that's just, a takeaway. When I taught there last in Milwaukee, my eyes were opened to some of the things that children were experiencing. And then there's lots of issues around race that can be uncomfortable for people, and people have to learn to communicate and trust one another. And I imagine with the political climate in the US now, that's everything is probably a lot harder. So, okay. At an implementation level, I could say that in a public Montessori, you would be really challenged to be able to implement the way we know is best for children. In a private Montessori or independent there, it would depend on the school leadership, whether or not that was an issue. Um, yeah.
You've worked in some very large public Montessori systems. The Milwaukee one has been there quite
Yeah,
a
it's
while.
huge. Yeah. At the
Yeah.
time I
Mm.
was there, there were only 3 schools. The school I was in had about 600 children, and every class went through age 3 through 12. So 3 to 6, 6 to 9, 9 to 12. There was only one class that was like I don't know what they were calling it, but special needs, inclusion, something like that, which was not a Montessori class. Every other class was. So we can say roughly 600 children, all with Montessori materials and Montessori teachers and Montessori environments and Montessori 3-hour work cycles. And, that was the hardest place I ever taught, but it was actually the best supported
Mm.
because everybody was on the same team. And we had a really wonderful liaison. And I think that makes all the difference in a public setting, because if you have a leader who's not Montessori trained, but who knows they need support with that, you need that support person. So we had someone who was really wonderful at that and helped, helped make it possible to do what you're trained to do, and helped the teachers understand where there was workability and where there was not. So, um,
I think there's a really good understanding in public Montessori in general in the US
mm,
that you need that liaison for
yeah.
the Montessori program. I think that's an issue here with our public Montessori programs, I've heard. Mm.
Although I have to say that there's also now, something that's happened since I left in 1998 is a big movement of charter schools, and many of those charter schools are Montessori. And the charter schools don't seem to have that. When it was, I guess it depends on how the program was founded, who the founding members were, and how long they stayed, whether or not that liaison situation was positive or not. But some of the teachers I've worked with who work in a charter school, I think have had more challenges because they are directed by people who might be like in some of our parent boards, say in independent schools, who have the best interests but not much knowledge. And they think, well, let's do this and let's do that and let's do that. And suddenly it's not actually a Montessori school, it's a Monte something school with a bit of Montessori flavor, but we're doing all these other things. And I think that does seem to happen in some of those charter schools, unfortunately. So that's also hard.
Yeah. So do you think that is some Montessori better than none, or do you think that they're really, if it's not done authentically, that it's really a negative experience?
Uh, I guess you'd have to look at it in a way on an individual basis. I would say generally, I don't believe that bad Montessori is better than good mainstream education, but it depends on what you want. If you're looking at it purely educationally by test scores or achievement, well, probably a good mainstream education is really going to be helpful for your child. If you don't want your child to go through that stamping out process and you want them to have an opportunity to spread their wings a little bit more and think independently, maybe Montessori is going to be better. But if it's a free for all, if it's not well implemented, I'm not sure that I would personally choose that for my child. So, um, I know there's never a perfect school. My children went to Montessori until they were 12, and then they went to state high schools, 2 different state high schools. So I got a lot of looks at different schools. Um, it would be great if there were such a thing as a perfect school, but all the schools are in transition, right? They have some new staff, they have some older staff, they maybe have things that they've been doing for a long time well, but those maybe need to change a little bit, or there could be many reasons that that a school is not my perfect idea. And so, yeah, I think we have to accept the good things and try and work on the things that don't seem to go so well in a school setting, knowing as parents that if we would like to help make things better, we probably can't choose everything and have everything change. You know, there might be in our tenure as a parent, there might be one or two things that we can support toward change, but we're not going to get a perfect school for our child. So.
So much seems to depend on the personality of the teacher. It probably shouldn't, but education really is all about that connection, right, between the adult and
Mhm.
the child, particularly in elementary. They say in real estate, it's all about location, but in education,
Yeah.
it's connection, connection, connection. And if you don't have that relationship, you got nothing, even in Montessori setting, even though it's about independent learning and
I
so.
feel like it's kind of a couple of different things. I feel like at a class level, you know, your individual child, absolutely. It depends on the particular teacher, the relationship that exists. But I also, you know, having been in Montessori in Australia for a really long time now, um, what have seen change over the time is how leadership works here. And when I first came, like when I was working with Liz and Hani, it was still mostly schools where you had a teaching principal. And that wasn't a fantastic model because it did overload one teacher who was usually your 9 to 12 teacher, right? But you did have people in the position who had some Montessori knowledge. And then I think schools went more toward the professional leader model. And I understand the reasons for that, but those people don't necessarily have the knowledge. And unfortunately, I feel that sometimes they come to our schools as maybe like a deputy from a bigger school, and we become a stepping stone for them to some other job that's more prestigious after they leave us 5 years later. And so they come and they want to make their mark. And they're not really listening to the staff about Montessori. They may have some great ideas about how to lead the school forward, but if they're leading it forward without understanding what our philosophy is and without working together with the parents and the children and the staff, then it becomes a conflict, right? So I feel like I've seen a lot of that. I feel like it seems to be changing again. Maybe because we have more people who are trained who are stepping up to leadership, and maybe that's because there's now an administrator's certificate or schools that can maybe afford to let a teacher become a leader because there's more training in Australia. I'm not sure why, but I definitely feel like there was a really long period of time where I was seeing that happen, and it didn't really benefit the school, and it didn't support the teachers. So they would come out of training and feel discouraged because there was a battle right away, or there were all these limitations on what they were permitted to do, or requirements of things they must do, which limited everything else. And so then you have unhappy teachers. And if you have unhappy teachers, you know, they might be doing a good job, but they're not bringing joy. They're not loving being there, and the children aren't going to love being there. So I find that kind of sad, but I really hope that I've seen a few glimmers of change recently.
You said your children were in Montessori till your twins till
Yeah.
12.
Yeah.
When they went to public high schools, did you, I mean, this is a really difficult question to isolate causes, what's your parenting, what's, their personality, their genetics, but what would you say, what did you hear from others, from teachers at their schools, stood out as something that could be traced back to their Montessori background? What different?
Oh, that is such a great question because I heard nothing because the teachers were not interested in that. I remember the very first conference that I went to. for at my daughter's school. So they each went to a different school, right? My daughter went to a school that was all girls, not because I'm so pro all girls, but they had a lot of sport and she was really sporty. And I said, oh, there'll be no competition for the sport money with the boys. You won't have to always get second best. So let's go to this school. Okay, so that's why we went to that school. And I remember the very first conference in year 7 where her maths teacher said to me, she managed to get and then fill in the number. I don't even remember. And that was the thinking. Like she was only concerned with the number my daughter got. And you know, you had like 6 or 7 minutes with each teacher. They were not interested in your child as a human being. They didn't care less about where they'd come from. You know, at the bottom of the 4 planes chart where we see that wedge that's divided up, and Montessori says this doesn't relate to that, was so true. There was nothing about Montessori. They were just, you know, and that was what I found interesting too. My daughter was very reflective on that. She already in year 7 was saying they only care if you do your homework and about whether or not this is going to be important for HSC. And I mean, you know, we're talking about someone in year 7 and there were 6 years of that gig. So,
Did
yeah.
you see their attitude to education change?
Oh, absolutely. They learned how to work the system. Would you like me to tell you what they learned?
Yeah, yes.
How to get around the requirements, how to do the minimum for the maximum effort during COVID, how to circumvent the system and have yourself marked as present when you're not really present on screen. I mean, so many things they figured out, which I have to give them credit for the ingenuity, because when I look at the requirement, I'm not sure if I agree with it or not, but they both worked starting from age 15 at McDonald's, of which I am not a great proponent because I'm not, you know, into multinationals and all that kind of thing. But I actually feel like their McDonald's work was more valuable than what happened at school because they learned to show up on time, wear their uniform, fit in with the team, follow rules. They work together with young people. My daughter, you know, eventually became a manager, had to figure out what you have to do when you manage these problems. During COVID, they could get out of the house. I felt like that was more valuable than what they got at school. The best thing at school was they had really nice friends. And, you know, at Montessori, by the time they got in 9 to 12, it was a limited group and they need a larger social group as they become teens. So that was valuable. My daughter still got these great friends and my son, but academically, I won't say the names of the schools because that would be terrible, but it was just stuff. Yeah,
I'd
just
have to concur with that. My 15-year-old works at a local hair salon and she's never late for work, but she's routinely late for her public high school.
yep.
So yeah, same issue. So what did you most love about your experience as a Montessori educator?
As a teacher, you mean, not a
Yes, we'll
trainer,
talk about
right?
your training a bit later, but
So, as a teacher, I think, you know, the children that we struggle the most with are the ones that stay with us the longest.
mm,
So I kind of can't say their names, but I definitely remember in my last teaching job, there was a girl who, I finished at Camaragal in about 2017, I think. There was a girl who had a lot of strife in her family, and I felt like when I would see her years later, she looked good and I felt happy. I felt like I helped with that process. Um, when I worked in the US in 3 to 6, there was a boy whose name I can't even remember now, but who had really interesting parenting background. His dad had been in the military in Vietnam and his mom was from Vietnam. So it was a mixed family in a time when maybe he felt like he stuck out more maybe as a child, and his parents were both older, so he didn't have a lot of confidence. And when it came to reading, he used to tell me, I can't read. And I used to say to him, don't say that. Say, it's hard for me, but I can do it. You know, it's things like that. Um,
that
in
relationship.
Yeah, it's about the relationship and helping. a person of whatever age take that next step towards something better for themselves.
Mm.
So, if you're giving a presentation with students on a training course and you see like the light go on, or if you're doing that with children and you see the light go on, I think that's what I like the most.
Yeah. And we're allowed to have those relationships in Montessori education, whereas it seems like that relationship component is being eased out in traditional education, and teachers are gradually being replaced by AI.
Yeah.
It won't be long before there's just robots in the classroom. And
Well, I like to think that not everyone will go along with that.
yeah. So what do you think have been some notable challenges in your time as a Montessori educator in the classroom?
Um, I think that there's been a bigger, like a big emphasis on all the admin stuff that relates to accountability. I don't think accountability is a problem, but I think the time involved in that documentation is really difficult for teachers. And, I've been out of the classroom for what, 7 or 8 years now, so I can only imagine it's become worse. But at the point when I was teaching, like I finished training of trainers and I went back into the classroom and I was training and teaching simultaneously. And I'd been doing it for a while. So I had in mind a system that I thought could work, that could help me to implement Montessori authentically, help me to do what I needed to do for the children, and yet help the Board of Studies or NESA or whoever they are have what they have. But I'd been doing this for a long time. And I think when someone first goes out and that's dumped on them right now, it's a big thing, right? So we tell them in training, you're meant to be doing everything. Cosmic education means you model and present everything to the best of your ability. You're doing the music, you're doing the art, you're doing all the content areas, you're doing the sport, you're doing the second language. And with all that administrative stuff, that's not really possible. So then it gets like chipped away, chipped away, chipped away. And then somebody's left with, doing bits and pieces and not really delivering cosmic education. So anyway, I don't know how I got down that track. Sorry, Mark. Told you I can talk.
Well, as a trainer now, as an AMI trainer who's been in the
Yeah.
classroom for many years on many continents, several continents, what advice, what candid advice would you give new educators who are just entering their first classrooms these days?
Well, I feel like one of the things is when you finish training, I mean, often nowadays people in training are teaching simultaneously. And I try to be really frank on the course and say, you're going to have no idea what you're doing until you finish the diploma. So just do the best you can by the children and the families. But your main goal is get your diploma, because it doesn't really all come together until you've completed all the lectures and you've done the kind of synthesis and review that we do just before exams. So do your best and worry about the rest later. But at that point, when they've really got their diploma, I think that you go out full of hope and expectation. And if you haven't been in the classroom already, or you've been the assistant, you're still thinking, wow, it's going to be perfect. You have to know that what comes from training is the ideal, the point to strive for, but it's not going to be like that at the start. And so I think you need to make yourself a list of what are your priorities. And, that might include your relationship with your assistant. That might be parent education you want to do. It might be material making. It could be any number of things for this place you're going into. I think you need to then take that list and like cut it in half, because you're not going to be able to do all that. Then I think you need to go through the half that you've got, and you need to figure out how can other people help you with, certain things. Like, what things could your assistant do? What can you get support from someone else in the school? That kind of thing. And then maybe have like 3 goals for yourself
Mm.
for the year. Just be realistic, because otherwise, I mean, I'm very much a glass half full person, but I think it's easy to slip into glass half empty and feeling like I'm not doing a good enough job. I'm not successful. And if you start looking at yourself that way, you're going to look at the children that way. And you're going to be judging the children instead of being there with the children. So that would be my advice.
Great advice. Yeah. I don't know. I don't know if you'd agree, but for me, I would say the most important part of Montessori training is transformation of the adult.
Hmm.
So, the materials, of course, are important that the opus of be able and backwards so that you're able to seize that teachable moment. However, it's more about the attitude that the adult brings.
Yeah.
How do you do transformation of the adult in your training programs? How do you mandate somebody transform, where look at their
Well,
own
look,
baggage?
you can't mandate it any more than you can mandate that a child learn from you, right? You can keep enticing them. I do feel that the face-to-face training makes a huge difference. I'm not a fan of the online video stuff. I don't mind those online orientation courses because that's for a different purpose. It's to share information. But to help someone really become the person that they need to become takes practice. And so I have not opted to do any of those courses where there's more online and you just come for a limited session. And that might, put me out of the market someday, but that's okay. I don't mind. Um, I feel like when you're there together, you're struggling together. You're seeing each other's strengths and weaknesses together, which is what we want the children to experience. You're noticing when your trainer lovingly and jokingly says, push that chair in. Remember, we talked about that, or whatever. Um, all of those little human interactions about simple stuff like how we carry something or how we respond in a conflict or how we clean up in the kitchen after our own lunch when we're all sharing a tiny kitchen. I think all of that is part of it because at the end of the training, you take all of those experiences, a really strong memory, and that's the first thing you do in your classroom, right? Until you develop maybe some more expanded skills or experiences within your school, that's what you're taking. So I feel like it's in the practice. It's in how you communicate and what you do with your time. And you can kind of remind people in a gentle way about stuff and you can joke, but you can't mandate it.
Would you say that transformation piece is really about learning to see the child as a mirror to yourself, not to see the child's antics as annoying, but to see them as a teacher for us, as a
Oh, that's what
reflection.
you mean by a mirror. I think that's a part of it. I don't think that's all of it, but I definitely think that's a part of it. Whenever we talk about human tendencies, whether it's on an orientation or a diploma course, we talk about the idea of psychic deviations that Montessori talked about and what does that really mean? I know some of those kinds of Montessori terms can put people off, but I usually describe it like this. I talk about the four planes and the self-construction. It's going to go forward. Someone unwittingly puts an obstacle in the path of the child. The child goes around that in order to continue self-construction. And this represents a behavior, a temper tantrum, a refusal, whatever, some negative behavior. But that's just a behavior, which is a response to this thing. And so I talk about that a lot. The child is not the behavior, that's a response to something. The child is this person that we've been talking about, who's you or me. We all have those tendencies. We all have that reasoning mind. All the 6 to 12-year-olds have those second plane characteristics. So in a way, it sounds like drumming that information in. But if you don't know that, if you think Montessori is, as you said, just a large bead frame and a box of, grammar symbols and that sort of stuff, you're not going to be able to do anything to help that child. So you have to really think about them as a human being and understand the foundation of personality and human behavior through a Montessori viewpoint.
You mentioned deviations. Let's just pause there for a minute. Yeah, I think Montessori, if I could characterize her general response to that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but my um, reading of her is that to correct deviations or misbehaviors, you really just get the child in front of the materials and get them focused and in flow. And that act of concentrating and focusing will correct a lot of their deviations. That was
Mhm.
uh,
Yeah,
her
I
theory.
agree. Yeah, I think it's we could call it the healing power of work.
Yeah.
So, once the child is enticed to engage with the materials, if you're in 3 to 6, you do the fade and observe. If you're in 6 to 12, you kind of stir the pot with the group and, oh, I've got another presentation. I've got to go now, but you guys take over from here. Let me know if you need any help. Whatever it is that you do. I don't work with adolescents, so I don't know what their shtick is, but I'm sure there's something. Whatever it is, you turn it over to them, you empower them. And I think that's where the healing happens. If it's in 3 to 6, it's the child in relation to this material and the concentration. But if it's in 6 to 12, it's always in the context of a group, right? Because their development is social development. So it's learning how to negotiate scenarios that may not be perfect for every child in the group. How do we sort this out together? How do we respectfully listen to each other's opinions? Um, yeah, so I think, yes, the healing power of work is all about getting them engaged.
Do you think that that still holds true in this day and age, or do you think it's some often a bit of an oversimplification, the idea that deviations can be corrected by through concentration? Um, the modern living has changed significantly.
Mm.
Childhood has changed significantly since a century ago when Montessori was alive and working. There are so many changes such as two parents working, phones, changes in nutrition, much less green play outdoors, um, a general rise in the level of anxiety that
Mhm.
children feel. Do you
Yeah.
think that, and that puts children in their brainstem much more than probably I wasn't alive a century ago, but although it feels like it sometimes, but it's probable that children are more anxious now than they were a century ago when they had less societal stressors or
Hmm.
different societal stressors. So that ability to concentrate, to sit down and focus is much more difficult now, perhaps because of that general rise in anxiety. And so
Hmm.
children need other skills that build that ability to concentrate that we perhaps were able to assume, um, 50 years ago or 100 years ago that we can't take for granted anymore. Would you agree that that's different, or do you
I
think?
feel like there's a lot of different things in what you said. So I guess first of all, I would say that what has changed is society, not human beings. So the things around us have changed, like the phones, or we have better nutrition. But I think when we take the ideas of self-construction and the human tendencies and understanding the four planes and characteristics or sensitive periods, whatever we've got working at that plane, that's constant. And we need to recognize that and like really trust in that. And then I also think it's important. I mean, I use those Montessori terms because she uses them, right? And I think it's good for those of us who are in Montessori to know them and think about what they mean. But I wouldn't use them with a parent or, someone outside our circle. I like to think about what does it mean. So for me, I feel like going into a Montessori class for a child should be like a meditation. It should be this place where you can experience that flow that you were talking about and where you're going to be kind of enticed into it, not forced. And it's not necessarily going to happen by working with the material first. It might happen by being out in the garden and digging with your fingers, even. It could happen in any different way. And I think In the Advanced Montessori Method, Volume 1, there's a chapter called My Contribution to Experimental Science, which is kind of heavy reading, but it's so important because she talks about this idea of polarization of attention. And it's based on experiences with 3 to 6 children, but we have to do that with any age level. We have to figure out what is the thing that gets this child in the zone, right? And then once they get in the zone, then we can start them on the path with what people typically think of as like working with the materials. But that might not be our starting point, the large bead frame or the checkerboard or decimal checkerboard or whatever. That's all secondary to getting them in the zone. So I also feel like, in your classroom, just the way you wouldn't have a buffet laid out with chips and lollies and stuff like that, you need to really be disciplined about what's in there. So I would be very careful about what tech I have and how it's permitted to be used. I would have thoughtful procedures around moving in and out of the room, because of course children need to do that, but we're not, proponents of just like a free-for-all, go run around the school campus. That's not helping the child in any way. But if the child needs gross motor activity, then we need to provide something. Maybe it's you're going to go do some yoga outside or ball skills or something. So I think we do have to like look at what she said, because I think what she said is so true and we've seen it so many times with children, and think about how do the current situations we face impact the steps we need to take in order to facilitate that point of concentration for the child. It's definitely harder than it was before, but it's not impossible because we can still see it happening in places. So we know that the human being is capable. And it's just like the art of the Montessori teacher to figure out what do I have to do to make it
Mm.
work.
Do you think that that is perhaps a bit of a weakness in Montessori, that 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 she didn't focus a lot on psychology? Like I've really enjoyed discovering the psychology of Alfred Adler and Rudolf Dreikurs, which I think is so compatible with Montessori principles, except that Adler focused on what she called deviations and didn't have much of a pedagogy, whereas Montessori focused on pedagogy but didn't focus really on deviations. Adler was born in the same year as Maria. I really wish they'd met and got married because he would have been so much better for her than Giuseppe Montesano. And
I
their
don't think
their
she would have
intellectual,
wanted to have been married if you look at her lifetime, Mark. I think the
yeah,
way it worked out was fine.
but their intellectual offspring, I think, would have been really revolution in next level revolutionary, because it would have addressed those psychological aspects of child development as well as the pedagogical. And today, with so many children in trauma, I think um, that seems to be an aspect that's missing from a lot of Montessori training programs. Would you agree?
Um, Look, I feel like there's only so much you can give to a person at a time. So in terms of in part of a training program, I think that's great to add to your continuing education afterwards. But I think the training needs to have certain limits around it so people know what it is I'm being trained to do, because there's so many then versions of other possibilities that you could run into with behavior, with special needs, all that sort of stuff. So like at a certain point, we have to say, this is the training, and then this is your continued professional development. So that's another whole thing. But what was I going to say? I feel like what we have with Montessori is like a very practical approach to those psychological questions, because she was interested in psychology. She makes references to things, but she didn't spend all her time doing it, right? She focused on what can we do to help these children and how can then we expand it into later years. And um, there's a really interesting article that it's called Montessori and the White Cross. It's some research on 3 to 6 work done with children in southern Italy in the like 19 teens and early 20s, and also children in Belgium, maybe 1920s or 30s. I'm not sure which war it would have been they had experienced. But anyway, 3 different groups of children in that sort of time frame. And it talks about, um, the success that happened with the children. And then it talks about it in terms of like current thinking around how to heal trauma. I find things like that really interesting because I've seen it work, so I believe it works, and I'm happy to spread the message. But I tend not to um, go too much into like why didn't she do this or why didn't she do that or why is she using those words if it's words that are not politically correct anymore. Let's not worry about them. Let's just worry about what she was trying to communicate to us. And I mean, sometimes there are analogies that are from the natural world that we can't even really understand so easily because that species doesn't exist to the same extent it did. And I just kind of let go of all of that. And I think, what is she telling us that worked before that we can implement ourselves? And what do we need to do to make it happen? And and I try
Great
to
advice.
keep
Yeah.
my eyes on that.
Yeah. What do you think are some of the challenges faced by Montessori education in Australia or even worldwide, but specifically in Australia these days, from
Um,
your perspective as a trainer?
You know how I mentioned all that administrative stuff that has cropped up? I
Mm.
feel like we have more and more rules and we are more and more risk averse here. And I don't mind, considering the risk and doing something so that risk is made less or not there at all. But I feel like there's a lot of that sort of administrative stuff that makes it so hard for us to do what we know works. And I feel sorry about that. I feel sorry that teachers get trained and then they go out and the battle they have to fight is so much about that sort of thing. And they have less time to spend on really preparing themselves to be that wonderful adult with the children, which is why they even got into it in the first place. Um, yeah, so all the documentation, and I see people get very worried about what's it called, when Nessa comes to check your school. I can't remember anymore. But that evaluation process, that makes me sorry too, because when I was working at Camaragal, I felt really strong, right? I was a trainer and they were happy to have me there. And I felt like, okay, I'm going to present what we're doing in a Montessori way. I'm not going to make it according to their sort of stuff. And it worked. It was fine. It took time and effort, but it meant that I was able to do what I was supposed to be doing instead of someone else's thing. And that's pretty hard for somebody when they first start teaching. And if you get on the wrong track, you can have a whole school that's sort of following that. How do we make ourselves look like their product when they actually want what we offer? They always love it when they see what we're doing with children. So that
And do parents, most parents, when they see Montessori, they want that for their children. And as one of the one of the first Montessori schools in the world in 1913 was a public school in Sydney,
yeah,
Blackfriars.
yeah.
More than a century and a decade later, why do you think there's not more Montessori? You mentioned earlier that we have very little public Montessori here. Why is that? Why do you think it's not been more successful in this
So do you
country?
mean why is there not more Montessori or why is there not more public Montessori?
Both.
Um, Look, public Montessori, I guess it could be that Montessori kind of got a reputation over the years as being for certain children and certain families. And I think it's taken a while to combat that. But I think in the bigger picture, my favorite Montessori book is Education and Peace. I feel like that's what this is really what we're about. That's why I'm doing it. I don't know why you guys are doing it, but that's why I'm doing it. And I feel like all of those things we do with children, of course, it helps their education, but we're doing it for that ultimate goal. And, a better society composed of citizens who can think independently and who have skills and knowledge, but who can think for themselves. And so some of the terrible things that happen in Montessori's lifetime don't happen in ours. And
We
I
need it more than ever now.
Oh, do we ever? And so I think that sometimes people get into Montessori thinking it's just, the large bead frame and whatever. And I'm sorry about that. I feel like there's way more to it. But I think if people read her work carefully, they recognize that it's about social change, and that can be very confronting. So I know that social change happens slowly. I think it was Martin Luther King who said the arc of history is long, but it bends toward justice. And I also believe that, but it takes time, right? It takes time for women to get the vote, for transgender people to be recognized as human, or whatever the current thing is we're on. So I don't see 100 years of Montessori as like a failure. Why aren't we bigger? I just feel like we're planting as many seeds as we can. How far can we take it in our lifetimes? And I think that's what Montessori did too.
Mm. What do you think Montessorians can do in this country to help change this and push it forward and make Montessori more accessible to more families in this country?
Uh, what do I think Montessorians can do?
Mm.
That's a good question. Because we all work as volunteers on committees most of the time, right? I don't know that there's necessarily something that individuals can do to help that. I do know that some of those people I was mentioning to you who are interested in becoming trainers are very interested in public Montessori. And when I first became a trainer, I felt like, yeah, that's my mission. And then I realized actually my mission is just to get enough people on a training course and replace the attrition, right? And I've been doing that for 10 years, and finally it feels like, oh, maybe someone else might join my team and we might have more people so we can, do other projects. So, maybe it's a retirement passion project. Maybe it's the next generation of trainers that can make that happen. If we look at like if I look at where Montessori is now in Australia compared to when I arrived on April 23rd, 1998, there's certainly more people, there's certainly more understanding, there's certainly more children involved. Is the quality better? I'm not sure. I haven't seen every school. There's always room for improvement. Um, but I think there is an increase in all of those things that I can feel like, okay, we're moving forward. And I'm patient, so.
Seems to me that there's an assumption in Montessori world generally
Mhm.
that this is such a great idea. Therefore, we just wait, people will hear about it and they'll come flocking. And I've been waiting for that to happen. It's in the 30 years since I trained and it hasn't happened. Do you think we need a more active advertising campaign in Montessori generally? Do we need, a world organization that has as its mission, it has an advertising budget and, actively goes out and seeks, an advertising firm to do our advertising?
Um, I can't see how that would really work, to be honest. So I guess, that Montessori quote that relates to second plane children about how the teacher is like a gardener and the presentations are like seeds that are being sown in the garden, and the garden is the child's mind. I kind of feel like we're all those seeds as well for Montessori. And, We know there are some places in the world where it's just at a starting point. There are other places where it's better disseminated, other places where it's better disseminated publicly as well as privately. I feel like all of that is an accumulation that's going to happen. I don't feel like there's a way to say someone needs to be in charge of it. You know how, I don't know if you've read Malcolm Gladwell, who's the guy that coined the phrase the tipping point, right? Maybe we'll get to a tipping point, but we're not anywhere near that in terms of families that have positive knowledge of Montessori, because I think there's still a lot of misguided information that results in not very good implementation, which results in families who are disgruntled, who go and speak just as poorly about Montessori as happy families speak well. So, and we don't have zillions of children in Montessori. We have thousands or tens of thousands, or maybe in some countries where they have really huge schools, maybe they have hundreds of thousands. But I think there's a lot further to go before we could consider something like you're suggesting, because many times schools and training centers are just working really hard to keep it going, like to have enough students in the school, to pay the staff, to have enough administrative staff to get the all that admin work done without, taxing the budget, or to have enough students to run a training course. I think we're still there. So,
Perhaps it's a chicken and egg problem, which comes first, the movement or the
mm.
individual school numbers. Do you think that the divisions within the Montessori world have anything to do with its uh, slow spread over the last century?
Maybe, I guess I haven't examined it well enough to know. I feel like, I took AMI training because it was what was available.
Mm.
I know a lot about AMI, and I understand why Montessori wanted to found AMI, and I feel like my mission is to do the best I can within AMI. So I feel like in a way I'm not really qualified to speak about what other organizations do, because I haven't really investigated them very very thoroughly. So are we all just working parallel and doing the same thing and we're moving forward? I hope so. Is it a barrier that we're not working as one thick thing rather than several separate lanes? I don't know if that's the case.
Yeah. I know that there's more Steiner schools in Australia than there are Montessori schools.
Mhm.
And yet, internationally, there are at least 16,000 Montessori schools worldwide, but there are only 1,100 Steiner schools worldwide.
Mhm.
And the only thing that can see as a possible cause of that difference is that there's one Steiner organization in Australia that speaks with a single voice. Not that there aren't squabbles within that, but they do speak with a single voice and they approach government with a single voice. And so I wonder whether that's possibly, one of the causes of their greater success.
It could be. Honestly, I couldn't say. And I feel like, there's a lot of history of organizations up and down, and I don't know. I prefer not to tread over those
Yeah.
paths and just think in a forward way, really.
Yeah. Do you think Montessori can save the world?
In the very long term, maybe if human beings are still here, but I think climate change is going to be a big challenge for humans. So I don't know if Montessori is going to save us. It might just be the thinking, creative, problem-solving mind of some human beings that saves us first.
You see signs of hope in these dark days? What keeps you going?
I'll tell you what, I'm doing an orientation course right now with people in Ukraine. That keeps me going. There are 16 people on it. The translator is in Odessa. They're in all different places in Ukraine. And the fact that they show up for the course and that they're doing the work, I mean, if they can do it, we can do anything, right?
Well said. What a great note to end on. Rebecca, it's been such a pleasure
Thank
talking
you.
to you. I
Thanks for
think,
inviting me, Mark. And it's so really nice to see all these familiar faces here. So I feel like I'm among friends.
would anybody like to make a comment or ask Rebecca anything before we hang up?
I could say something. Rebecca, you're looking very well, very good at the moment. And
It's
I'm
the
glad
good
to see
lighting, Honey.
you're doing good. But I just wanted to share something that still sticks with me from back when we worked together and we had the children in your under your care. And one of the things that I still hold dear is that one I think you travelled overseas several times while during term, and you sent cards to the children. And
Mm.
I read those cards, and it's always so touching. And I've still got it. And I think sitting somewhere there where it was send one to Simon and saying about what you're doing on the trip, and also and at the end of it, it was signed your friend Rebecca, and that's a beautiful card, and I've always held that in the
Thank
family.
you.
Yes.
That's really, really nice. I avoided telling any stories about your children when Mark asked because I thought that would be a little too, but I definitely have one in mind for one of your three children that was in my class.
Okay.
Anyway, it's good to see you all.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Mark.
All
Thank you.
right. Well, thank you, everybody.
Thank
And we'll see you in a couple of weeks for another Montessori Lives.
thank
Thanks again,
you.
Rebecca.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Toodaloo. Have a good night, everyone.
Good night.